Hi everybody, my name is Shannon and I work at Hestan Smart Cooking. Today we're going to talk about how we leverage data to improve recipes. So we all have this idea of an aspirational dish, that one dish that we'd love to try and cook. For me, that dish is pad see ew. It's one of my favorites to order at restaurants, but I never make it myself. Think, what is that dish for you? And why haven't you made it? Some of you may be thinking about all the time it would take to prepare and cook the recipe. Some of you may be thinking about all the ingredients that you'd have to find and buy at grocery stores and specialty stores. Others of you might be lacking the right equipment. Some of the recipe tasks might be a little bit daunting. I argue that the biggest blocker for people is confidence. It's intimidating to cook new recipes, and the risk of failure is high. Think about the last time you cooked something that you were super excited about and it turned out horribly. You're probably a lot less likely to take another risk after that. We used to solve this problem with apprenticeship. For many of you, the first cooking experience you probably had was standing next to your dad or your nana or your big sister and watching them cook. And then soon after, having them guide you along as you cook your first recipe. This was very much a two-way conversation where you could ask questions, you could watch techniques, you could get feedback. This experience naturally built up your confidence. But today, people are busier. Both parents work full-time, kids have all of their activities. Today, people turn to cookbooks and the internet. They ultimately turn to recipes when they want to learn how to cook something. For illustration purposes, I actually found a recipe of pad see ew and I cooked it. I'm a pretty amateur home cook, and so even when I follow all the steps in the recipe, I still feel like there are parts that I'm missing. Turns out, this recipe also had some issues. The recipe called for wide rice noodles. At the store, I could only find rice flakes, which looked mostly like what I wanted. I ended up texting a coworker asking if these were right. Then when I went to go soak the noodles, I didn't realize that you were supposed to soak them in hot water, not cold. 2 hours later, I ended up just boiling the noodles just to speed up the process. Didn't get a photo of the final product because I was so hungry at that point. All in all, turns out this recipe wasn't quite enough for me. This leads me to the big idea of today's talk. What's wrong with our recipes? And why aren't they as good as the apprenticeship model? Let's take a step back and look at how recipes got to be the way they are. In the beginning, recipes started out as two-way conversations. They weren't even written down. People shared ideas, they asked questions, they talked to each other. But people soon realized that this wasn't scalable, and the first written recipe was created around 1600 BC. It's actually a recipe for beer from Mesopotamia. Written recipes were then rose to popularity in the 16th and 17th century with the printing press, and the first images were put in cookbooks in the 19th century. Up here, we have the first American cookbook called American Cookery, which was published in 1796. The advent of television brought about the first cooking shows. Chefs could now show viewers even more about what they were doing. The very first cooking show was called Cookery, and it aired on BBC in 1946. Up here, we have our beloved Julia Child sharing all of her knowledge. When the internet came along, we had our first online recipes, which allowed us to start sharing more and talking to each other. Now we have hundreds of recipe websites and blogs where people post recipes. With these hundreds of recipe websites and blogs, we get hundreds of recipes for the same dish. I did a Google search for chicken tikka masala recipe, and I got over 21 million hits. I can take the top hit and hope that garners me good results, or I can try and read some of the reviews and pick a recipe based on that. But I have no concept of the cooking levels of these reviewers. Maybe they're all much better chefs than me, or they've had a lot of experience cooking Indian food. On top of that, when I open up a recipe and I start reading some of these reviews, I get very mixed messages. KJ Koskin from Texas thinks this recipe's a keeper. A cook from Michigan shared this sentiment with an ooh la la, saying this recipe is superb. But Simbo Dunks was disappointed with the bland flavor. And Amy Rhea agreed, saying she was shocked at how bland the recipe was. This gives me a little bit to go off of. Now I know that there's a possibility that I'll love the recipe, or maybe I'll find it too bland. But I still have to start with the original recipe and taste and modify and taste and modify. We may think that the ability to comment on recipes has led to a conversation, but it's still not the same as the back and forth that we get when two people are standing next to each other in the kitchen. The comments on recipes are standalone. They're not responses to other people's comments. The internet has given us so much more data surrounding people's cooking, but a large percentage of it is relative. It's subjective. What we need is objective fact. So I realize I haven't introduced myself very much. I'm an engineer at Hestan Smart Cooking, where we build a guided cooking system called the Hestan Q. It's built up of a Bluetooth-enabled burner and a temperature-sensing pan that, when paired with an app, guides you through recipes. I, being one of the contributors to the system, like to think that it's the next step in the evolution of the recipe. When we originally started, our goal was to control heat more precisely in recipes. No more turn your stove to medium-high and hoping that your medium-high is the same as the recipe creator's medium-high. Instead, the recipe sends precise commands to the burner so that you're always cooking your salmon at 385 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition to controlling heat, it turns out that the data we're collecting is extremely valuable to the evolution of the recipe. I'd like to show you an example of this with our pan-seared scallops recipe. Here are a few photos from our users. Here's another one. Look at that really beautiful sear. And one more. We have some really happy people out there with some really tasty scallops. I'd love to tell you that everything is perfect and that every recipe comes out perfectly, but occasionally we still get a user who reports an issue with a recipe. A user sent this photo of their scallops to our customer support, upset that his results didn't turn out the way he expected. And he's right. We expect what we saw in the previous photos. Look at how uneven these scallops are. A couple of them aren't even seared. And take a look at the pan they were cooked on. See all the sticking? All the burnt bits? But before I delve too deeply into these photos, I want to pause and talk about some cooking data. We collect data in the form of pan temperatures and burner power levels from user cooks. This data is then grouped together into what we call a cooking session, which allows us to correlate this information with the steps of a recipe, essentially reproducing a cook. Up here, we have a cook of caramelized onions. We have the temperature graph with minutes elapsed on the x-axis and temperature in Fahrenheit on the y-axis. The orange line represents the target temperature, and the blue line represents the actual pan temperature. We get our pan temperatures from the thermocouple that's in the bottom of our pan. I've broken up the graph based on the steps in the recipe. We start off with initial preheat. Once we reach the target temperature, we add the butter in. Notice that initial temperature drop once the butter is added to the pan. Butter is about 18% water, which means that it takes quite a bit of energy away from the pan, explaining both the initial temperature drop and the elapsed time of the temperature increase back up to the target. Next, we add the onions in. Onions are about 90% water, which drops the temperature even more significantly. Notice the temperature rise back up to the target. This takes much longer relative to the butter because of both the added volume of the onions and the higher water content. Okay, this is the really cool part. Notice all the spikes in temperature as we're caramelizing the onions? That's the user stirring the onions. The colder, wetter onions at the top of the pan are brought down to the bottom where the thermocouple is. The water then evaporates, causing the rise in temperature, and then the user stirs again, bringing the temperature back down once again. And then notice in the subsequent steps, the amplitude of the spikes is decreasing as all the water boils off and the temperature and the water content of all the onions becomes more uniform. We can tell how many times someone stirred the onions from this graph. How awesome is that? Now here I have a temperature graph of our pan-seared scallops recipe from a demo we did. Here's a pan-seared scallops graph by one of the chefs. And here's a temperature graph of our pan-seared scallops recipe from a user who cooked them and loved them. You can see how all the temperatures line up pretty well. This is to be expected, and is one of the reasons we get such consistent results. Remember this photo that I showed you earlier of the scallops that the user sent to customer support? Well, we pulled the temperatures for that cook, and we can immediately see the difference. Look at how from minutes 6 to 8, the temperature is much lower than what we expect it to be. Let's think about why this might have happened. Maybe the burner power level was too low. Well, we can answer that question by taking a look at the power graph. So up here I have the minutes elapsed on the x-axis and the burner power level percentage on the y-axis. The orange line represents a typical scallops cook. Don't worry too much about all the details. I mainly have this graph up here for comparison to the blue graph, which is the graph for the scallops cook we're examining. Look at how from minutes 6 to 8, we can see that the burner is not only on, but it's operating at full power. Remember, for the temperature was much lower than what we wanted it to be for this entire time. This indicates that the burner was at full power, but still not able to get the pan contents up to temp. If you remember from the caramelized onions, liquid takes a long time to heat up. So there was likely too much liquid in the pan at this point. Where was all this liquid coming from? Well, with scallops, grocery stores often add sodium tripolyphosphate to them, which causes them to absorb up to 30% of their weight in water. This is great for the grocery store because you pay by the pound. This is not so great for you because now all of your pan heat is going to evaporating the water as opposed to searing your scallops. The scallops the chefs tested on were fresh from fish markets. Simply drying these overly wet scallops wouldn't have been sufficient. Putting all this data and information together, we were able to diagnose the problem and see how often it occurred for users. Turns out it was a fairly common problem, so we iterated. We improved our recipe to provide a better experience for everybody. The chefs added in a step to the recipe to brine the scallops to extract some of that excess water, as they realized that the majority of people would be buying previously frozen scallops from the grocery store. This is big. Recipes have looked like this and stayed like this for a very long time. I know it's hard to read, but on the left, I have the recipe for burnt sugar cake from the 1975 edition of Joy of Cooking. On the other side, I have the recipe for burnt sugar cake from the 2006 edition of Joy of Cooking. These recipes are almost exactly the same. If you struggled to bake this cake in 1975, chances are you're still struggling to bake this cake in 2006. With each cook of a recipe where the data collection is happening, users are providing feedback every single cook, giving chefs more knowledge about where the recipe is succeeding and where it's failing, allowing the recipe to continuously evolve and adapt. This modification of the recipe is the beginning of a return to that idea of a two-way conversation while cooking a dish. We now have this feedback loop where users and recipe creators can pass information back and forth. In our case, the user sent the scallops photos to Donato, our support person. Donato then sent them to Chef Owen, who surmised that the pan was likely too wet based on the sticking he saw. Andre, our scientist, was then able to confirm this by pulling the graphs. Hillary, our recipe editor, then went and edited the recipe, adding in the brining step, which went back to the user, ready to be cooked again. Ultimately, what we're seeing is that this evolution of the recipe is building more and more confidence in our users. People are taking more and more risks in the kitchen, and day by day, they're getting closer and closer to cooking their aspirational dish. Thank you.